Hello, and welcome to week 53 of our 2 year Bible study. We are right in the midst of King Solomon's reign. And last week we saw in First Kings 10 the visit of Queen of Sheba. Second Chronicles 9 is very much a parallel to First Kings 10. It does talk about the boundaries of the land in Second Chronicles 9, and we see that the boundaries of the land that are being discussed in Second Chronicles 9 are parallel to Genesis 15, verse 18, the land that God had promised to Abraham. Now, to be clear, Solomon is not the single king over all this area, but he is, all the other kings are vassal kings. In other words, they pay tribute or submit themselves to him within this area. So his kingdom has grown to everything that God had promised to Abraham. And so again, we see this is a very between David and Solomon, a very critical time where God is fulfilling his promises to Israel. And this ought to have been a motivator for them to continue to be faithful to God, proper response for what God has done. And yet we see in First Kings 11 that this does not happen. God had said in Joshua that the Canaanite cities in the land either had some of them, about seven of them, had to be utterly destroyed because of their evilness, but the rest of them could make peace with the Israelites if they wanted to, but they had to turn from their pagan ways because God said, if you leave cities in the land, they're going to influence you away from Him. Well, in a similar fashion, the pagan wives that Solomon had married, probably from treaties that he had with other nations or city states, they turned Solomon's heart to other gods. And I want to take just a moment to talk about four primary gods that are talked about either in this passage and certainly going forward from here. The two main Canaanite gods or Hittite gods that are prevalent are Baal and Asherah. Baal is the chief god, think kind of like Zeus, and he is the provider of rain for the land. And he was worshipped primarily through sexual rites. And then Asherah is the mother god, and she is the provider of fertility and harvest. And she also is worshipped through sexual rituals. Baal and Asherah together, Baal provides the rain, Asherah provides the fertility. There's a harvest between them. And this is what makes all the good things happen, prosperity happen in the land. And so Baal and Asherah are very sexual, ritual worship religions. You also have Shamash, and Shamash is similar to Baal from one of the other nations. And again, you have sexual rituals, but in Shamash, you also have human and animal sacrifice. So Judaism obviously had animal sacrifice. Human sacrifice was forbidden completely by God. It's detestable to God. But Shamash was similar to Baal, so provider of rain for prosperity. And so you have these sexual rituals and then human and animal sacrifice. Molech is the fourth god, and Molech is the god of the underworld. And his primary way of worship is through human and child sacrifice. And so Solomon begins to be influenced through his wives to begin worshiping along with Jehovah some of these pagan gods. And so God says that if Solomon had been faithful to him, that Solomon's dynasty would have continued into his children. But because of his disobedience, God is going to split the nation. And this is told through one of the prophets to Jeroboam. And Jeroboam is a garment is ripped up, 10 patches are given to Jeroboam and says these are the 10 northern tribes. And then if you're paying attention, it says just one patch is given, is kept for Solomon. And if you're paying attention, there are 12 tribes. So why doesn't Solomon get two? Well, Solomon already has Judah, or Solomon represents Judah. And Solomon is going to be given Benjamin by God, and then the other 10 tribes will be given to Jeroboam. It's at this point we also I wanted to add in both Proverbs 30 and Proverbs 31. So when we take a look at these, are written by people other than Solomon. We're not exactly sure of their timing or dating, so this is as good a place as any before we move on from Solomon to put Proverbs 30 and 31. In verse 4 of Proverbs 30, it says, "Who has gone up to heaven and come down? Whose hands have gathered up the wind?" Well, that's God, clearly. "Who has wrapped up the waters in his cloak?" Well, that's God, clearly. "Who has established all the ends of the earth?" Well, that's God, clearly. "What is his name, and what is the name of his son?" Surely you know. So verse 4 is clearly speaking of God, but what of his son? And I really do believe that this is a prefiguring of Jesus within the book of Proverbs, where God is talking about paying attention to the one who comes, who is the Son of God. While the rest of Proverbs 30 focuses on groupings that have typically an unexpected twist to them. And then Proverbs 31 ends the book with a description of the wife of noble character, which really brings the book full circle, since the wife is wise. And Solomon has been telling his son throughout the book of Proverbs, follow wisdom, don't follow folly. Wow, that segues nicely into 1 Kings chapter 12, where we are introduced to Solomon's son Rehoboam. And Rehoboam, as we see, is quite foolish. Rather than listening to Solomon's advisors and lessening some of the burden that Solomon had put on the people, Rehoboam instead foolishly tries to intimidate the people. The 10 tribes separate from him, and so he is left with Benjamin and Judah. God tells Rehoboam in verses 22 and 24 uh, not to go against the 10 northern tribes. Verse 23, "Say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says. Do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing." So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again as the Lord had ordered. So Rehoboam is foolish, but at least initially he listens to God. But later on, at the end of chapter 14, we find out that he's been going up against war against Israel all throughout his reign. And so there's clearly a foolishness that is surrounding Rehoboam. Jeroboam, fearing the people returning to God, so going back to Jerusalem to worship God, he sets up temples in Bethel and in Dan. Now, the temple in Bethel is particularly egregious because the temple in Bethel is where Jacob saw um, the staircase or the ladder going up and down between heaven, and named Bethel the house of God. So now, where the house of God is, where this dream by Jacob was, now they have set up a false temple. And then Dan, you'll remember at the end of the book of Judges, did not like the land that had been apportioned to them by God. So they went and destroyed very peaceful people up in the north. And they had also already set up a calf up there that they had been worshiping or that had been picked up along the way, and that they started worshiping. Both temples mimic the true temple. We know this both archaeologically and by some of the ways that's being described here. You'll notice that Jeroboam in verse 33, on the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. And so he instituted the festival of the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. In order to understand how deviant this is of Jeroboam, we need to remember the Jewish festivals. So this festival is being set up to rival the festival of booths that happens on the 15th day of the 8th month. So it says that he set it up in a month of his own choosing, but to be clear, he's setting it up during the most celebratory festival of the Jewish calendar. It's a great time to say, well, they're celebrating down there in Jerusalem, but we have a great revelry up here as well for our festival. But of course, Jeroboam can't set up a festival at the time of Passover because that talks about God's rescue of his people. He can't talk about unleavened festival of unleavened bread because that represents the removal of sin, which is just the opposite of what's happening with these false idols. He can't set up first fruits and weeks because they talk about God's provision in the midst of the harvest, and all of that provision in the harvest has been taken over by the fertility of Baal and Asherah in the minds of the northern kingdom. You can't talk about trumpets in the Day of Atonement because that's the preparation for accountability to God. So he steals the one festival, the festival of booths, the one that celebrates God's, well, in its true form, celebrates God's blessing on people, turns into this prosperity festival where there's all sorts of likely revelry as they worship these false gods. And so they're setting up a false worship that very much mimics the worship that God had said, this is the only way that you can approach me. Now, I have set up, and there's a link for it on the Bible study page, a timeline of all the kings of both Judah and Israel. You'll notice that some of them overlap, and that's because you do have co-regents at times where you have two kings or three kings sometimes ruling at the same time. I've also put on there where the books of the prophets, the time frames that they were written, as we go through First and Second Kings and Second Chronicles, we're going to want to know kind of when those prophets were prophesying, and so that timeline should be helpful for you to kind of keep track of where we are as we go through these different kings. Well, First Kings chapter 13 talks about a man of God from Judah going to speak to the king, but he wasn't supposed to spend any time in Israel. And then another prophet lies to him and gets him to spend time there. And it's just a warning to us. Just because people say God says something doesn't mean it is true. The older prophet was lying. And sometimes people lie and say that God says something that isn't true. But ignoring God's true word is devastating. And we see this in both the younger prophet as well as in Jeroboam. God had said that he would establish Jeroboam's line if Jeroboam had followed God, but ignoring God's true word is devastating, both for the younger prophet as well as for Jeroboam. Well, in chapter 14 and 15, things have gotten so bad so quickly in the northern kingdom that God says in verse 15, and the Lord will strike Israel so that it will be like a reed swaying in the water. He will uproot Israel from this good land that he gave to their ancestors and scatter them beyond the Euphrates River because they aroused the Lord's anger by making Asherah poles. Already, just this soon, exile is already being prophesied for the northern kingdom. And as we'll see, the southern kingdom isn't too far behind. At some point, Pharaoh from Egypt comes and attacks Jerusalem, takes away all the gold shields that Solomon had created. And Rehoboam is in a bit of a bind here. And so he, in verse 27, made bronze shields to replace the gold shields and assigned these to the commanders of the guard on duty at the entrance to the royal palace. Whenever the king went to the Lord's temple, the guards bore the shields, and afterwards they returned them to the guard room. He tries to replace the gold with bronze, which from a distance can look like gold, but it's just the fakes. And it's just fakes of what the gold was. And so he's doing this in order to save his reputation. So we see two very foolish kings, evil kings in many ways, in Rehoboam and in Jeroboam. In that timeline, before I forget, there are either E or R after the names of the kings, and an R represents a righteous king, and E represents an evil king, based on how Scripture describes the king. So we now are looking at a divided kingdom, and throughout the rest of our study, up until the exile, we're going to continue seeing the parallel stories of this one kingdom that has been split into two.